Killing Them Gently, a supernatural mystery of horror and suspense. Written by Thomas Fincham. Narrated by Stephen Michael Preston. Stabbing Them Gently, Episode 8. I sat in the Escalade with my face in my hands. I had been crying for what felt like hours. My best friend was dead. What made it worse was that I was responsible for his death. If I hadn't contacted him, maybe, just maybe, he might have still been alive. I had reconnected with Ray out of loneliness. He had become my link to Peter Murphy's life. I was Peter Murphy until 12 bullets turned me into Alex Weller. Detective Murphy of the Clydesdale Police Department had been gunned down in an alley. Detective Weller of the Clayton Police Department had taken his place. If it sounds complicated, it is. After Murphy had been shot, Royce, my guardian angel, had given me a second chance as Weller. In return, I was solving strange and unexplainable crimes in the hope of becoming Murphy again, so that I could resume my life with my wife Rosie and son Maddie. So far, I had followed through with my end of the bargain. I had apprehended a baby-snatching police officer, killed a murderess who worked as a real estate agent, stopped a headless motorcyclist by reburying his body, and helped bring down a cannibalistic chef. These were just a few of the cases that had been thrust upon me to solve. How many more I had to go through, I still didn't know. It was why now, more than ever, I needed to speak to Royce. "Royce!" I screamed. "Where are you? Show yourself!" The urge to cry overwhelmed me again, and I wept like a baby. Tears streamed down my face. I cried until there were no more tears left. I wanted Royce to appear as he had done many times before. I wanted to make another deal with him. I wanted him to bring Ray back. Ray didn't deserve to die the way he did. He was tortured. I felt like a coward for being in my Escalade now. I should have stayed with Ray, but instead, once I found him dead, I ran away. I didn't know how I could have explained being at his house at that time of the night. What purpose did I have for being there? Alex Weller did not know Raymond Chan. Peter Murphy did. To save myself, I left Ray the way I found him, slouched on his sofa, his body covered in cuts and bruises. I rubbed my temples. I had a pounding headache. Even if I was able to go back to my life as Peter Murphy now, how would I live with knowing I had something to do with Ray's death? I had no proof that his death was somehow related to me, though. But deep down, I knew that it was. Until recently, his life was never in any danger. I put him at risk. Ray had always been there for me. He was the person who knew the truth about me. He knew I was Peter Murphy in Alex Weller's body. He could have not believed me when I told him. He could have run away, but he didn't. He believed me and did his best to help me. It cost him his life. I should have never put him in that situation. I should have dealt with my problems on my own. But I needed someone to confide in. Ray was that person. Even talking to him gave me the support I needed to keep going. I bit my bottom lip to control my emotions. Ray had talked about flying someplace nice when this was all over. Now, he would never get that chance. I rocked my head back and forth. Why did this happen? What had I done to deserve more pain? I felt like my world was falling apart around me. Rosie and Maddie's lives were already altered by what had happened to me. Now Ray was gone by associating with me. Who else would get hurt being near me? Miranda? Davis? A part of me didn't want to find out. A part of me just wanted to sit in the Escalade and die. It was better if everything ended. This way I could be done with this nightmare. I couldn't endure any more of this. The torment was too much. There was no point in going any further. I didn't know how, but I fell asleep. I woke up to the ringing of the cell phone. My head was fuzzy and I felt disoriented. I shook my head to chase away the sleep. The cell phone continued ringing. I knew what it was, another case, another horrible murder. I wanted to let it ring, but after waking up, I felt a little different. Ray's death would be with me forever. It was something I would have to live with, but I couldn't let this killer get away with what he had done. Ray was tortured. I would do something far worse to his killer. Renewed energy now pulsed through me. I still had a mission to complete. I had to solve these cases so that I could go back to Rosie and Maddie. If I gave up now, I would be giving up on them. I couldn't let that happen. I parked in front of what looked like a hotel. I caught Superintendent Brian Davis by the entrance. "What happened to you?" he said as I approached him. "You look like hell." My eyes were still red and puffy from crying. I didn't sleep well last night. "You're still not sleeping in your car, are you?" I didn't say anything. I had been asked once or twice before where I was staying when I had moved to Clayton. If I remember correctly, I hadn't given a definitive answer. Davis leaned in. "That's why we have hotels, you know." He pointed to the building behind him. "Maybe I'll book a room here," I replied. He shook his head. "Not this place." "Why not?" "I'll show you." We walked through the lobby, and I immediately noticed that the interior was in a horrid state. The paint had begun to peel off the walls, the carpet was dirty and stained. The furniture looked like it hadn't been changed in 30 years. Davis headed toward the stairs instead of the elevators. "They don't work," he said before I asked. Luckily, the crime scene was only 3 floors up. The third-floor hallway was in a similar state as the lobby. In fact, it was worse. The carpet was missing entirely. We walked on concrete. Davis grinned. "You still want to move in?" "If the price is right," I shot back. We ducked under the yellow police tape and entered a room. Like most hotels, the room was small. In the middle was a queen-size bed with a small table and a chair next to it. An old television set was placed in front of the bed. When I looked carefully, the television had knobs to change the channels. "It's a black and white model," Davis said. "It was high-tech when it came out. Probably still is." The wallpaper in the room was peeling, and the once white ceiling was now yellowish-brown. "It's in here," Davis said. We turned right, and I was in a small bathroom. A female body was leaning halfway into a filled bathtub. Her head and part of her arms were submerged in the water. "Where's Miranda?" I asked. Detective Miranda Butterfield had become my partner when I was transferred here. She had endured alongside me on these strange and odd cases. She was normally the first person I spoke to about the victim. "She's downstairs," Davis said. "I don't suppose you know anything about the victim?" I asked. "Nope. You'll have to ask Miranda." I examined the victim. She looked to be in her early to mid-20s. She had long, dark hair, and she was still fully clothed. "Why would someone still be dressed when they're getting ready to take a shower?" I asked. "That's what we pay you for, Weller," he said. "You'll tell us the who's, the why's, and the how's." My eyes narrowed in deep thought. "Maybe she wasn't here to take a shower," I said. "What?" Davis said. "Look at her clothes," I said. "It looks like she was getting ready to leave." Davis made a face. "Seems like a stretch, Weller." I pointed to the bathroom sink and cabinet. "Her purse is there, and she's got her makeup kit out." Before Davis could counter my theory, I said, "Believe me, she came in here to put on makeup, but then—" I stopped. My mind was going through all the scenarios. Then someone pushed her into the tub from behind. They held her head under the water until she drowned. I could tell Davis was thinking about what I had just said. "Are you sure?" he finally said. "I am, but let's make sure." I pulled out a pen from my pocket and leaned over the body. I gently pushed the hair from the back of her neck aside. "Have a look," I said. "Well, I'll be damned," Davis said. "You are something, Weller." Red marks were clearly visible around the pale skin. They indicated that something had firmly gripped the neck to hold it down. "Was there any indication of forced entry?" I asked. Davis shook his head. "Then it may have been someone she knew and who was in the room with her. Or it could be someone who worked in the hotel and had access to the room." Davis nodded. He was still mulling over what I had said about the victim. Talking to Davis wouldn't get me closer to finding out who did it, so I said, "I think I'll go downstairs and see what Miranda's up to." Miranda was in the building manager's office. "You don't look so good," she said the moment she saw me. I shrugged. Davis said the same thing. "Still having problems sleeping?" she asked. Miranda had no idea about my other life, and I wasn't about to tell her now. You could say that, I replied. So, what have you got? This is Paul Cromwell, she said, introducing the man in the room. Mr. Cromwell not only manages the building, he is also the owner. Yeah, he said. I just took over the property a month or so ago. I turned to Miranda. The victim? Lucy Thompson, age 24. She's an aspiring actress. Any boyfriends or exes? Nope, she's new in the city and single. I faced Paul Cromwell. Do you have any security cameras? We do, but they don't work, he said, embarrassed. We were hoping to get new ones installed soon. How many rooms are in the building? I asked. 65. All occupied? No, we've not had full capacity in a very long time. As you can see, the building is not in any shape to attract many customers. The people we get are those who need a cheap place to stay or those who aren't able to find other accommodations on short notice. Why did you purchase this property? I asked. It used to belong to my family. My grandfather owned it almost 50 years ago. He sold it when my father was young. The company that owned it for the last 20 years neglected it. It came on the market dirt cheap, so I thought I'd buy it. Can you provide the list of your current occupants? I said. He left the office and then returned with an old leather-bound ledger. He placed it in front of us. I scanned it and noticed that of the 65 rooms, only 24 were occupied. The owner wasn't kidding when he said the place wasn't full. Can we talk to them? I asked. Sure, he replied. We spent the better part of the day interviewing the occupants of the hotel. We found seniors who had been using their Social Security checks to camp at the hotel. We found junkies who used the hotel to shoot up. We found escorts who used the hotel for providing their services. We found gamblers who used the hotel to hide from whomever they owed money to. We even found business people who used the hotel to get away from whatever stresses they were dealing with in their lives. All the occupants used the hotel to be on the fringes of society. The hotel was perfect for that. It avoided any unwanted attention and, for a low cost, gave them the anonymity they required. As we walked down the halls, Paul Cromwell said, I hope to change this place, you know. I'm hoping to get some investors together and build this place up to what it used to be when my grandfather owned it. I am going to restore it to its original glory. The eagerness in his voice made me hope he was successful. We stopped at the last name on the list. John Dell Johnson. John Dell is a single mother, Paul whispered to me. She doesn't have a place to stay, so I let her stay here for free. In return, she helps with the laundry and sometimes with the cleaning of the hotel rooms. I didn't ask her for it. She wanted to do it on her own. I nodded. I liked Paul, even if he did have plans to fix the hotel and displace all these people. We knocked and waited. A few minutes later, the door opened. A heavy-set woman answered the door. Behind her, children were yelling and screaming. Mr. Cromwell, the woman said, nodding to the owner. John Dell, he replied, smiling at her. Miranda and I flashed our badges. Can we ask you a few questions? Miranda asked. The woman yelled into the room, and the children went silent. Is it about that girl who died? John Dell asked. It is. You're next-door neighbors. Did you know Lucy Thompson? John Dell shook her head. No, I never talked to her. I didn't even know her name. She kept pretty much to herself. Did you hear or see anything last night? I did, John Dell said. My kids were sleeping, so it was quiet, you know, and that's when I heard noises. What kind of noises? She shrugged. I can't really describe them. It was like... She paused to think. Like there was someone with her, and she was fighting them. Fighting? Miranda said. Struggling might be a better word, I think. Did you see anyone leave her room? Actually, after I heard the noises, I went to my door and peeked through it. And? That's what's surprising. I never saw anyone leave. I thought it was odd, so I waited for, I don't know, a very long time. Afterwards, I called Mr. Cromwell, and he went in and found the poor girl. I said, Are you sure you didn't miss someone leaving the room? No, absolutely not, John Dell said. When I went to my door, the noises were still coming from next door. They stopped, and I thought someone would come out, but they didn't. I didn't see anyone inside either, Paul said. I looked over at Miranda. I knew what she was thinking. It sounded like the perpetrator had vanished into thin air. We were back at the detective division when I excused myself. I went to another part of the police station where it was quiet. I dialed a telephone number and waited. After a few rings, Ian Tanner answered. "This is Alex Weller. How are you?" "I'm good, considering I have to watch my back now," he said. A few days earlier, I spotted a man in a Ford 4x4 following me. I was certain it was the same man who had attacked Peter Murphy. I had warned Tanner to be careful. "I'm calling about the murder in Clydesdale," I said. "You heard about it?" he said, surprised. "Yes," I said, but considered my next sentence. "I'm not sure if you know this, but he was a friend of Peter Murphy's." Tanner went silent. I heard papers being shuffled. "Raymond Chan," Tanner said. "He was a lawyer. I never met him, but I heard Peter mention his name. I didn't want to make it sound like I had any direct relationship with Ray. It would complicate things." "Are you sure?" "Positive." There was more silence. Then Tanner said, "I hope you are not making any connection between Peter Murphy's attack and this man's death." "I most certainly am," I said. "What proof do you have?" "None. At least not yet." I heard breathing from the other end. "Until you can give me something that links both cases, I don't know what I can do." "I just want you to keep an open mind," I said. "It's more than a coincidence that after Peter Murphy was attacked, his best friend was murdered." "I'll look into it," Tanner finally said. "Thanks," I said. "Do you know where they took his body?" "Raymond Chan's?" "Yes." "He's at Clydesdale City Morgue." "Thanks," I said, and hung up. Instead of going back to the detective division, I headed for the parking lot. I got in my Escalade and drove straight to the morgue. I knew I wouldn't be able to concentrate until I saw Ray once more. My abrupt exit from his house the night before didn't give me enough time to say goodbye. I owed him that much. Ray died for my sins, and the least I could do was visit him for the last time. I parked in front of a gray granite building. When I was a detective for the Clydesdale Police Department, I had been to the morgue on many occasions, so I knew the place inside out. I went down the stairs and, as I had hoped, I found Willie Marjorie behind the main desk. Willie had been working at the morgue since the beginning of time, so to speak. Willie had seen thousands, maybe even tens of thousands, of bodies come in and out of the morgue. Willie was over 70 years old, but he had a mind as sharp as any 20-year-old today, if not sharper. "How can I help you on this fine day?" Willie said enthusiastically. Willie always made coming to the morgue seem like it was a visit to your favorite ice cream shop. I held out my badge and said, "I would like to see a body that came in last night. The victim's name is Raymond Chan." Willie scrunched his face, examining my ID. "How come I've never seen you here before?" he said. "It's a bit of a drive from Clayton," I said. "I'm sure it is," he said, not believing me. He placed a heavy ledger in front of me. "Sign here and we'll go visit your client." He gave me a smile. We went to the back. From one of the freezers, Willie pulled out a large metal surface. On it was the body of my best friend. "You look familiar," I heard Willie say. "Why do you say that?" I said. "I don't know. You remind me of someone. I just can't put my finger on who." "This is the first time I've been here, so I'm not sure," I said, not wanting to encourage him. "Right." He moved his head up and down. "Okay, I'll leave you to do your business." With that, he left. I turned to Ray. His eyes were closed, and his skin was pale and blue. Seeing him in this condition, my emotions started to bubble up inside me. I feared that I would break down right then and there. I bit my bottom lip. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I was shaking. "I am so sorry, Ray," I gently whispered. "I am so sorry for everything." I couldn't control it. I cried. At that moment, I felt like a lost and confused child. In some ways, I was lost. I didn't know what was going on, and I was still coming to terms with what was happening around me. Ray was the one thing from my other life I could hold on to. Now he was gone. I was alone once again. I wiped my eyes with the back of my sleeve. I didn't want Willie or anyone else seeing me this way. I looked down at my best friend for the last time. "Goodbye, buddy," I said softly. "May you rest in peace." On my way out, I was stopped by Willie. "Now I know who you remind me of," he said. "Who?" "Peter Murphy." I didn't know what to say. "I can remember people by the way they walk and talk." I understood. Even though I was in Alex Weller's body, I still had Peter Murphy's mannerisms. I'm sorry. I've never met him. I lied. He nodded as if he finally believed me. Peter was a nice guy. Sad what happened to him. You would have liked him. I'm sure I would have. He sat in a lounge chair staring at the television. He was in his wife-beater and shorts. He didn't feel cold because for some strange reason, the hotel always had the heating on full blast. He was wearing socks, though, which should account for something. Kobe Madsen was over 6 feet tall and close to 250 pounds. Getting sick was not something he worried too much about. He took a swig of his drink and placed the bottle on the table next to him. A game show was on. Kobe hated them at first, but now he had come to like them. There was nothing else to do in the hotel anyway. Ever since he hurt his back at work, he stopped doing much. When his disability checks kicked in, he decided to move into this dump. He could have saved money by staying in an apartment, but his ex-girlfriend would have found him for child support. It was better to hide here than deal with her constant nagging. He heard a noise. He turned the volume down and listened. It was coming from the bathroom. What the hell? He thought. Grudgingly, he lifted himself off the chair. He made his way to the bathroom and turned the lights on. The faucet was on. Water flowed freely into the sink. He scratched his head. He turned the knob and the water shut off. He turned to leave. The faucet came on again. What's going on? He grumbled. He turned it off again. He watched and waited. To his surprise, the knob slowly rotated as if something or someone was turning it. He rubbed his eyes in disbelief. He quickly shut the water off. This is not happening, he told himself. He should lay off the bottle for a while. Behind him, the shower curtain slowly pulled off its hinges. He caught it in the mirror. He turned when the curtain wrapped itself around him. He tried to pull it off, but it held on tightly. The plastic curtain sealed all the air around his face. He couldn't breathe. He thrashed around the bathroom, trying desperately to get it off of him. He smashed into a wall, the impact putting a large hole in the drywall. He spun and hit the mirror. The glass cracked and shattered everywhere. He then fell onto the ceramic sink, his weight causing it to collapse. His body went limp a couple of minutes later. Kobe Madsen was dead. Carl was back inside the room. He had just told the man about what he had discovered. Are you certain he told you that? The man growled. As usual, Carl couldn't see the man's features. They were hidden in the shadows. Yes, Carl said. Raymond Chan told me Alex Weller is really Peter Murphy. Impossible, the man roared. He could be lying. I don't think so, Carl said. I worked on him for a couple of hours. No one could tell a lie under that much pain. The man was silent for a moment. How could that be? You shot Peter Murphy. I did, and he is still hidden somewhere by the police, Carl replied. But this guy, Alex Weller, has been poking his nose where it shouldn't be. And now I believe he is doing it to find out who was behind Peter Murphy's shooting. The man crossed his arms. If what you say is true, the man said, then we have no choice but to eliminate Alex Weller. I was driving back to Clayton when my cell phone rang. It was Miranda. They had found another victim. I pressed hard on the accelerator. The Escalade shot down the highway. I parked in front of the hotel and got out. I entered the lobby. I passed a woman and a young boy. I continued walking, but then stopped. Rosie! Maddie! I turned and rushed out onto the sidewalk. I looked around, but there were no signs of either of them. It was as if they had disappeared. I shook my head. Was I hallucinating? Did I actually see them? The answer was most likely the former rather than the latter. There was no reason for my wife and son to be here, so far from Clydesdale, let alone to be at a hotel like this one. It just didn't make any sense. Miranda was waiting by the stairs. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said. It's nothing, I replied, shrugging it off. We walked up to the 5th floor. I was out of breath from taking the stairs. I was in worse shape than I thought. We entered a room. He's in here, Miranda said. A large man was slumped on the floor of the bathroom. His head and face were covered in a plastic sheet. That's the shower curtain, Miranda said. I leaned in to take a closer look. By the looks of it, the victim had suffocated. His name is Kobe Matson, Miranda said. According to the owner, he moved in a couple of months ago. I spotted Paul Cromwell by the front door. He looked pale, and rightly so. This was the second murder in his hotel. If business was bad before, it would be downright ugly now. I looked around the bathroom. It was a mess. It looks like he had a scuffle with someone. Any witnesses? Miranda shook her head. We asked the neighbors, but they all swear they saw no one leave the room. I thought about it. If the perpetrator didn't leave through the front, then they must have left through somewhere else. I left the bathroom. I passed the king-size bed and stopped at the large windows. I fiddled with the latch and the window pane slid open. I looked through the glass. I saw nothing but concrete all the way down. I thought of that, Miranda said from behind. There's no possible way the perpetrator jumped out the window. There has to be an explanation, I said. I wish there was, she said. I looked around the room. There was obviously no space for the perpetrator to hide. We were at a dead end. Out in the hall, I paced back and forth. A motive, I said. There has to be a motive for these murders. I faced Paul Cromwell. Was there anyone against you purchasing the building? I mean, someone, perhaps even a guest, who was aware of your intention to renovate the property and was not in favor of it? Paul thought about it. As a matter of fact, yes. His name is Walt Humes. When I was planning to purchase the property, he confronted me several times and told me not to do it. He said it would be dangerous for the guests. Dangerous? I said. Yeah, he said if I bought it, I would be risking everyone's lives. Why didn't you report him to the police? He didn't say it like it was a threat, and also, I didn't think he was serious. I thought he meant if I bought the property and fixed it, a lot of the regular guests would be forced out, and so in some ways I would be affecting their lives. Plus, he paused. Plus what? I said. Paul shrugged. Walt is over 80 years old. What damage could he do at his age? I leaned over. If Humes couldn't do it himself, there is no stopping him from hiring someone else to do it. Where can we find him? Cromwell shook his head. Walt used to live in the building, but after I bought it, he quickly moved out. Something else occurred to me. Why wasn't his name on the list of guests? He had been living in the building for 50 years. He moved in when my grandfather owned it. He was practically a permanent fixture here, so I guess the previous owners never made him sign in and out. I rubbed my temples. We needed to locate Walt Humes. And fast. We were back at the detective division. Miranda and I were on our laptops trying to find Walt Humes' whereabouts. He had lived on the outskirts of society almost all his adult life. Digging up information on him was far more difficult than we had imagined. Miranda said, Humes has been convicted of several bank robberies decades ago. She turned her laptop so I could see her monitor. A black and white photo was on the screen. Naturally, Humes looked young, but he also looked thin and frail as if he had not eaten in a while. He was given 8 years for the crimes, but he served half of that. He then fell off the grid. I suddenly had an idea. I called Paul. He picked up after a few rings. Does Humes receive his mail at the hotel? I asked. Sure, Paul replied. This was practically his permanent residence. Can you tell me where his mail is now being forwarded to? I can check. He put me on hold. He then returned and gave me an address. I hung up and said, I know where we can find him. The house looked newly built. It visibly stuck out from the other houses on the street. They were relatively small, single-story, while this one was large and double-story. Even though Humes was over 80 years old, we weren't going to take any chances. We rang the bell while keeping our hands near our holsters. If we sensed anything wrong, we were ready to withdraw our weapons in a split second. The door opened and an older woman appeared from behind it. Can I help you? She slowly said. We flashed our badges. Does Walt Humes live here? Miranda asked. The woman shook her head. Miranda looked over at me. We have reason to believe Mr. Humes' mail is being forwarded to this address. Yes, that's correct. We were confused. Why is Mr. Humes' mail being delivered to your address? Miranda asked. The woman shrugged. Walt recently moved and he needed someone to collect it for him. I offered to help. Do you know where we can find him? Walt never gave me his new address. He used to live at that hotel. How does he pick up his mail from you? He drops by my practice. You are Walt's... Miranda let her words trail. I'm his psychiatrist, the woman said. Miranda gave me another look. I knew what that meant. Was Humes having psychotic episodes which pushed him to commit murder? We didn't know, and we certainly couldn't ask his doctor. We didn't have a warrant, and their doctor-patient relationship prevented us from asking her directly. Miranda pulled out her card. If you see or hear from Mr. Humes, please give us a call. It's important that we speak to him. On the drive back, we stopped and grabbed a bite to eat. It wasn't my idea, it was Miranda's. Ever since I had become Alex Weller, I couldn't remember how many times I had eaten. It seemed that somehow I had lost my appetite. We ate in silence. It was relief, though, from what we were going through in our personal lives. My life had turned upside down. I not only had to find who shot Peter Murphy, I now had to find who killed Raymond Chan, too. Last I heard, Miranda's marriage wasn't holding up. Her husband Andrew had decided to go on another business trip, putting the full responsibility of their son Elliot on her. She was stressed, and so was I. The bizarre cases, in a strange way, were an escape from what we were dealing with. As we sat in the restaurant, the sun hit us directly, providing a warm feeling inside me. I suddenly felt as if everything would be okay, that I would find a solution to all my problems. But this feeling didn't last long. It faded just as quickly as it had come. I didn't complain. For a brief moment, my worries were gone, and I was grateful for it. I noticed patrons of the restaurant looking over in our direction. To them, we looked like a couple. In another time, in another place, perhaps Miranda and I could have been together. We got along well, and in many ways we understood each other. We were more alike than I could have imagined. We were both devoted to our children and our spouses. Through all the issues in my life, I never once considered leaving Rosie, and I sensed that Miranda never thought about leaving Andrew, even if she disagreed with some of his actions. Plus, we were both highly motivated in completing our duties. We would do anything and everything to find the perpetrators and bring closure to the victims. This determination had served us well in our careers. After we had quietly finished our meals, we drove back to the station. Upon our return, Davis rushed over and said, "There's someone here to see you." "Who?" I asked. "He said his name is Walt Humes." "Where is he?" I asked loudly. "In my office." The first thing I noticed about Humes was how tiny he was. Or maybe it was his age that had caused him to shrink. He sat in a chair that looked like it would swallow him whole. His hands were wrinkled, and so was his face. He looked every bit like a man who was over 80 years old. More importantly, he didn't look like a man who was capable of murdering two people. But it was our job to confirm this for a fact. "Dr. Kendricks told me you were looking for me," he said. I understood that he was referring to his psychiatrist. "We would like to ask you a few questions, Mr. Humes," I said. "Sure, fire away." "Did you have anything to do with the murders at the hotel?" I asked. He shook his head. "I heard about them, but why would you think I had anything to do with them?" "You had confronted Paul Cromwell, the owner of the hotel. In fact, Mr. Cromwell stated that you said buying the hotel was dangerous to the guests. Is that correct?" "Yes, it is." I was confused. I looked over at Davis and Miranda. They, too, were eager to know what he meant. "Please elaborate," I said. "When Paul Cromwell bought the hotel, he put our lives in jeopardy." "You will have to be more specific, Mr. Humes," I said. "Who is responsible for the murders?" "Burnham Cromwell." "Is he related to Paul Cromwell?" I said. "Sure is. He is his grandfather." "Are you saying Paul Cromwell's grandfather murdered those two people at the hotel?" Hume shook his head. "No, it was Tyrone Chandler who did it." I was now utterly lost. Maybe there was a reason why Humes was seeing a psychiatrist. "Who is Tyrone Chandler?" I asked. "He was Burnham Cromwell's partner." Seeing that we were still not following him, he said, "Tyrone and Burnham built the hotel over 50 years ago. They had put up their own money and started running it. Well, at first the place didn't do too well, and these guys started losing money. So they borrowed money from the wrong people, and by that, I mean the mob. Back in those days, the mob controlled most of those types of joints. Anyway, the business started picking up. It was one of the swankiest places to stay in the city. I could see Hume switch his vernacular whenever he spoke of his youth. But one day, Tyrone disappeared. He just up and left. People thought he may have had a disagreement with the mob and that they took care of him, but I knew better. What really happened? I asked. I found myself somewhat intrigued by his story. I was one of the first people to stay at the hotel, he said. How could I afford it, you might ask? Well, let's say not all the money I took from the banks was found. I sensed he relished that fact. I'm not saying what I did wasn't wrong. It was. But I did my time, and I figured I deserved to live a little. Anyway, I knew all the employees at the hotel, and through them, I found out that Burnham and Tyrone were having arguments. It was Burnham's idea to take the mob's money, and Tyrone didn't like that one bit. He thought the mob was bad for business. They were always asking for freebies. Plus, the police kept raiding the place. Anyway, I heard that it was Burnham who killed Tyrone, and, you're gonna like this, he buried him somewhere in the hotel. Why didn't you tell this to the police at that time? I asked. I did, but they never listened. They were certain it was the mob. Anyway, after Tyrone disappeared, we started finding dead guests at the hotel, just like it's happening now. So, let me get this straight, I said. You believe it's the ghost of Tyrone who is responsible for the current murders? Absolutely, he said, clapping his hands. But why now, after all these years? It's because Burnham's grandson bought the property. Tyrone won't rest if any of the Cromwells ever control the hotel he helped build. You have to realize that soon after the first murders, Burnham quickly sold the hotel and left. Once he did, the murders stopped. I think he knew it was his old partner who was behind them, but he couldn't tell that to the police. There was silence in the room. No one said a word. I know you think I'm crazy, Hume said, but you can check to see if I'm telling the truth. Those first murders were just like the ones now. Is that why you left the hotel in a hurry? I finally asked. Sure did. I wasn't going to stick around and take my chances. I still have a long way to go. Where are you staying now? I asked, in case we needed to bring him back for more questioning. He gave us an address for a motel. Until I find a permanent place, I've asked the good doctor to watch my mail, he said. Thank you for coming down, I said. Sure, I should have come sooner, he said. I would like to go back to my old place, though, if it's safe again, and if you can find Tyrone's body. I was curious. If we were looking, where would we find it? I heard Burnham had buried it in the basement. He's telling the truth, Miranda said. She and I had double-checked Hume's story. We had to. It sounded outrageous. Miranda continued. Almost 50 years ago, several guests had been murdered at the hotel. One was found with a corkscrew stuck in his neck, another was found with a handkerchief shoved in his mouth, while another was found hanging by his tie. No one was ever charged for the murders. I can guess why. Because no one was spotted going in and out of the victims' rooms, I said. You got it. I don't know if I believe Hume's story entirely, but it would be careless of us not to follow through, I said. Grab Davis. I have a feeling we're going to need his help on this one. Are you sure? Paul Cromwell said. We had just told him Walt Hume's story. We had also made sure to let him know that most of it checked out. I can't believe this. He fell into the chair and put his face in his hands. I said, until we can be sure of what's going on, I would advise that you leave the building. I can't, he looked up. It's all I've got. It's for the safety of your guests. He thought about it and then nodded. But first I have to check on a room. It has a leaky pipe. I just need to seal it quickly. I can't afford any major water damage right now. "I'll go with you," I said, "but we need access to your basement." He handed us a bunch of keys. Miranda said, "We'll let you know if we find anything." With that, she and Davis were gone. Paul Cromwell was underneath the sink. With a wrench, he tightened a pipe. He then got up and turned the faucet on. He watched the water flow into the drain and then said, "Done." I nodded urgently. I wanted him out of the building as soon as possible. If there was a vengeful ghost running around the hotel, I didn't want to provoke it any further. We were leaving the room when we heard a noise. It sounded like dripping water. Paul doubled back, and when he pulled the cupboards open, he found the same pipe underneath the sink leaking again. When we looked carefully, it wasn't water coming out of the pipe. It was blood. "How is that possible?" he said in horror. My eyes narrowed. I wasn't sure either, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out. "We should leave," I said. We rushed to the front door. It slammed on us. We heard the locks clicking into place. Paul pulled out his keys. He shoved one of them into the lock but couldn't turn it. "It's stuck," he said. I tried as well, but it felt like the key was glued in place. I pulled out my cell phone and called Miranda. "We're stuck in a room," I said. "Something bizarre is happening." "Do you want us to come up?" she said. That would be a waste of time, I thought. It would take someone much stronger than Davis and Miranda to break through the door. "No. Find Tyrone Chandler's body as soon as possible." I hung up. I pulled out my gun and motioned for Paul to keep his eyes open for anything unusual. He palmed the wrench in his hand. The room's lights started flickering on and off. It gave me a headache and I felt disoriented. Then, just as quickly, the flickering stopped. I looked over at Paul. Like me, he wasn't sure what was happening. Like me, he was utterly scared. "Look out!" I screamed as a lamp flew through the air and right at him. He ducked just in time before it slammed and shattered against the wall behind him. "I think it's after you," I said. "But I didn't do anything," he protested. "It doesn't matter. Your grandfather did." Then, right before our eyes, the television set lifted above the TV stand. It hovered 4 feet in the air. I knew its target. I quickly got in front of Cromwell. I held my gun before me, but I didn't know where to aim. The television set rocked slowly back and forth. It was waiting for me to get out of the way. I wasn't going to. Then something flew from the wall next to me, and before I could react, it hit me squarely on the side of the head. I fell to the floor. I looked up and saw that it was a large wooden photo frame. This left Paul exposed. He tried to move from his spot, but the television set flew across and smashed into his body. Glass from the screen fell everywhere. Blood poured from the areas where the glass had cut him. I looked around the room. I knew that whoever it was, if it was indeed Tyrone Chandler, he was using the objects in the room to hurt us. I spotted a glass bottle. I lunged for it, but before I could grab it, it flew away and floated in the air as if teasing me to reach for it. It then smashed into the side of the TV stand, revealing sharp edges. It was now a deadly weapon that could be used to cut or stab us. I wasn't going to wait and see what happened next. I retrieved my gun and aimed it. I wasn't a great shot, but I wasn't a bad one either. I fired 2 bullets. The first one missed the bottle, but the second one shattered it into small pieces. This bought us some time. I hoped it was enough for Miranda and Davis to find Tyrone's body. But then, we heard a loud noise. The bathroom mirror had been smashed. "Grab the mattress," I said. "We'll use it as a shield." Paul and I lifted it off the bed and pushed it against the wall. We hid behind it, holding the edges of the mattress. We waited, but then something powerful snatched it away from us. The mattress flew across the room and landed on another wall. I knew what was waiting for us. 2 large pieces of the broken mirror hovered in the air. The sharp edges were pointing directly at us. I couldn't shoot the pieces of glass. By the time I even aimed and fired a shot, the glass would have pierced me. The glass rocked slowly in the air, and then flew toward us. I shut my eyes, bracing for the impact, but it never came. When I looked again, the glass was on the floor, inches from our bodies. I looked over at Paul. Like me, he had a look of relief on his face. I later found out that Davis and Miranda had found Tyrone's bones behind a wall in the storage room. Had they not found them in the nick of time, Paul and I would have surely been dead. I was in my Escalade. I was driving on the main road. It was safe to say that Tyrone Chandler would no longer hurt or harm anyone at the hotel. Paul Cromwell was free to renovate the hotel and restore it to its former glory. As for me, there was something I needed to do. I drove up and parked in the driveway. Raymond Chan's house was dark and now empty. I ducked underneath the yellow police tape and gently unlocked the front door. I still had a key from my previous visit. I slowly walked through the house. I felt a shiver go up my spine, and I knew it was because my best friend had been tortured and murdered here. I went to the living room and stood before the sofa. The last time I was here, I didn't have time to survey the scene. I was in shock and in a hurry to get out. But I remembered seeing something at the time, and I hoped it was still there. The police had gathered and tagged all evidence they thought was vital, but there was one thing they may have missed. I found it at the foot of the sofa. It was the butt of a cigarette. Ray wasn't a smoker, but he kept ashtrays around the house for guests who smoked. The police may have thought it was his. They were wrong. This belonged to his assailant. And, if I was correct, this also belonged to the man who shot Peter Murphy. Using tweezers, I gently placed it in a plastic bag. I now had DNA evidence that would help me find the man who had turned my life upside down. This has been Killing Them Gently, a supernatural mystery of horror and suspense. Written by Thomas Fincham. Narrated by Stephen Michael Preston. Copyright 2019 by Thomas Fincham. Production copyright by Thomas Fincham.